Hey guys, today I want to share a bit of a perspective on why I believe in God. And this is going to come from a very interesting place. For over 20 years, I've been thinking about this, and I've had a lot of conversations with a lot of different people. I think today I want to present one of three fairly original arguments for God's existence. You may not have heard of these arguments before. I've been thinking about them again for the better part of 20 years. Before I get into that, though, I want to talk a little bit about my approach and my way of thinking when it comes to belief in God. I think, a lot of people know, if they've gone and looked into it, that attempts to prove God are not new. They've been around for centuries, millennia. A lot of people might be familiar with Thomas Aquinas's five proofs for God's existence. I personally have found these very intellectually compelling, and they're quite strong. But for me, they don't really operate from an experiential or phenomenological, which is to say, experiential first principles. So when we think about the first mover, the first cause, contingency, dependency, the argument from gradation, or when we talk about something that is good, we must therefore think of an absolute standard of that, of what is good. The argument from design, they're all very compelling and they appeal to me at a certain point in my life. But the issue for me, what I found with these arguments is that they got you to a designer, but they didn't quite get you to the God of the Bible and specifically the God of love. I want to talk about how do we get from first principles to the idea of God as a loving being. And here's the premise of the first argument, and it's that love is structurally fundamental to the way the universe operates. I'm going to go into this a little bit more a little later. Um, a few other principles. This channel is called The Convergent Christian. I like to identify where the truth lies, and it often lies at the intersection of various different strands of facts. Right, when I can arrive at a certain conclusion through many different ways, I'm more and more confident that that conclusion that I'm arriving at is the right one. Right, and even in my day job as a consultant, right? When we want to make a hypothesis or want to prove something, we want to attack it from various angles to create robustness around that conclusion, right? So, say we want to conclude something about a business, we want to look at various different financial data to come to that conclusion. I think the same thing must be said about thinking about God. And so, today I'm going to present to you the argument from consciousness. For these arguments, and just for this one in particular, God here is not in a logical entailment. Oh, of course, there's logic to the argument, but he's more seen as a unifying explanatory center across various different disciplines. So, the argument from consciousness, what is it? The argument is this, and then I'll go through it step by step, and then I'll go through some objections that people might have about it. The argument from consciousness is that the structure of consciousness, I'll define that a little later, is ordered towards a self transcending love. Okay. Self transcending love, a love that goes beyond the love of the self. And that this structure is ontologically, that is from an essential character, is not really intelligible, right? It's not really understandable unless ultimate reality is personal and self giving. Okay. So consciousness is fundamentally about a self-transcending love, and that this is a consciousness is the ultimate reality, right, of which we are all based in, and we can't really understand what the meaning of this ultimate reality is without realizing that it is personal and self-giving. Okay, so I'm going to go through the argument step by step. It's going to make a lot more sense by the end of this video, hopefully. Okay. So the first claim that I'm making here in this core claim, if I were to decompose into three steps, is that consciousness is irreducibly first person, which is to say, there is no description or third person description of neuronal firing patterns or whatever you might want to call it that appropriately captures what it's like to be a subject. Somebody, close your eyes and remove every single thought. There's this isness about you. There's this witness There's something there that has the capacity to feel things, to sense things. I'm not talking about the sensations themselves. I am talking about the fact that there is something there that can feel sensation. There is something that it is like to be like you. And to be like you, it is not the same to be like me, right? There's this uniqueness in every individual. So, this consciousness, this isness at its most fundamental level, it's not just a qualitative experience. It's got various aspects to it, right? There is a self awareness, right? And that's uh, quite unarguably, I think, unique to human beings. It's normatively structured. And what that means is that isness about you knows what it ought to do versus what is the case, right? It has a certain way of wanting to behave in a certain way. And that could be conscious, it could be subconscious, but it's ultimately even the subconscious. There's something there doing the subconsciousing, if you will, even though you might not be aware of it. And I think the term consciousness can sometimes have too many meanings, but conscious means I'm actively thinking about it. But even when I'm not thinking about something, there's still something there, someone there experiencing that lack of thinking about performing a particular action. And then, lastly, that consciousness, among many things, it is also an ability to, it has a capacity rather to self donate itself, right? It has a capacity to sacrifice itself. Now, when we talk about consciousness in a kind of a very fundamental level, I think it is fair to swap that with when people call mind, right? So, mind, this isness about the mind as a one could say a property of consciousness, insofar as it is not necessarily physical. I think this is what Origen talks about, the second century Alexandrian church father, in that insofar as consciousness or mind, you can't measure it, right? It doesn't have a color, it doesn't have a shape, it defies physical explanation. Uh, and think of it a little bit like playing a video game, right? So when you play a video game, um, I can't fully exhaust the sensation that one has playing a video game, right? By merely talking about electrons moving through a transistor or a motherboard. I can't fully recreate the experience of playing a video game by describing its the motion or the movement of electrons. The experience just has to be experience. You have to just feel it. You know, to be modulated by something is not the same as that modulation being the thing itself. So something can be modulated by, so controlled, if you will, or modulated by something, but the thing that's doing the modulating is not the thing that is being modulated. So, for example, the radio waves, if I'm listening to a radio, if I'm in that generation, music is not the same as the radio waves that carries the music. The music is not the circuitry, it's not the bouncing around of the waves, right? It is an experience. In the same way, an orchestra or music performance, it's not the same as the notes or the players or the instruments, right? There's something. Even if I put all those things together, if I don't have the capacity to hear, then there is no musical performance that is um, that I have that I can sense, right? So all those things can be in place, and yet the sensation, music itself, may not exist if I don't have the capacity to hear. As an example, think about this computer or your TV at home, your HDMI cable. The HDMI cable and the data that flows through that HDMI cable is not the same as the episode that you're watching or the feelings you get from watching that episode. And fundamentally, what we're all talking about, what all these examples have in common, is that there is information at the bottom of these things. And if I wanted to sharpen this argument a little bit, I would say, into a kind of a more formal structure, I might say that if X is identical to Y, right? If an experience is the same as neurons, then a complete description of the neurons would appropriately explain uh, the experience. A complete explanation of neuronal activity would actually give me the experience of the neurons, or the experience that I'm purporting to explain. A complete description of a complete physical description rather of neural states unfortunately, will never exhaust conscious experience, right? Therefore, a conscious experience simply is not identical to neural states. A neural state is a map, if you will, but the territory is the actual experience. The map is not the territory. And one can say that information, right, is more fundamental to reality. Because if I think about, the neuronal states and all of that, these are all the mediums that code the information, which is the experience, right, of living, right, and all these are configurations, if you will, of consciousness. So all that to say, in this first step of the argument, the bottom line, and I'll go into it a little bit more in the objections. I'm just here to explain it for now, is that experience is different than the modulators of experience, and there's a certain first person experience that is consciousness, which is irreducibly first person. It cannot be boiled down to something material. Okay, so we've got this thing called consciousness that we all have, we all participate in, if you will. The second step to this argument is that the highest act of consciousness is self sacrifice. Human consciousness produces acts where survival is completely negated for the sake of another organism. So think about martyrs, parents running into burning buildings to save their kids, soldiers falling on grenades. These events are often, if anything, anti fitness. And there's an intentionality to these acts. And one can argue, as I will a little later, that the acts, the highest acts, the deepest acts of consciousness is this self sacrifice. The third step in this argument is that um, when we talk about genuine love, the self is not erased during genuine love, but it's fulfilled through a gift, right? There is a great German um, writer and theologian called Jürgen Moltmann who talks about this self-emptying act of love. There's a certain self-limitation when it comes to creation. God has to empty himself, if you will, to create this negative space of the true void to allow room for love, for his love to act and create something that is ex nihilo. Now, and the argument really, this is the kind of the third step, that love involves an ontological self emptying, where the consciousness must empty itself, right, to allow for something new to arise, right, or for existence to be. Um, The argument is this: if ultimate reality is just a blind mechanism, then consciousness is just an accidental epiphenomenon. Self sacrificial love is just an evolutionary glitch, rather, or it's an illusion of some sort. And the highest human experiences are metaphysically completely groundless, right? But if ultimate reality is actually self given consciousness, then our consciousness participates analogically, at the very least, in that ground of being. Love is just not a trick of matter or an illusion of some sort. And that sacrifice itself, the nature of sacrifice, mirrors the structure of being. Okay. So let me just summarize. We have three steps to the argument. Right. The main argument is that the structure of consciousness is ordered towards this self transcending love, that the nature of consciousness is that of love, and the nature of true love is self sacrifice. Okay. So consciousness, a, the ultimate ground of being is consciousness. Consciousness' highest calling is self transcending love, and the nature of that love is sacrificial. So those are kind of the three steps of the argument.
Okay, so the first objection that I want to go through is I want to make the argument that consciousness cannot be reduced to non-conscious processes. So we talked about this idea of reduction. Reduction means I can explain one thing through something else, effectively. So I can take this microphone, I can explain its structure by breaking out all its parts, how they fit all together, and by doing so, I can kind of fully put together the microphone. I can fully explain it. I can explain the the nature of a cloud by breaking it up into smaller particles, and I can talk about how the water molecules all kind of fit together and the forces between them and so on and so forth. So there's three ways of thinking about causation in general, philosophically. There's causal reduction, so one thing causes the other, right? So in this case, mental states are caused by brain states. I'm not going to argue against that in this video, and I'm not going to, so we can accept that as true. There is no problem, and for the purposes of this video, in accepting that mental states are indeed caused by brain states. If someone were to get drunk, their conscious awareness is going to change because their brain is now swimming, metaphorically speaking, in alcohol, right? There's correlational reductions. Conscious states correlate with certain neural configurations. So we're also not going to argue that today. That's perfectly acceptable. The reduction that I do want to argue against is ontological reduction. And it would assume that consciousness is just neural activity, nothing over and above it. This is absolutely wrong. And we can start to sense why this is wrong, right? By thinking about what it means, the type of knowledge associated with experience that cannot be received through other means, okay? There's something fundamentally different about an experience than of anything else that we could choose to know. So for example, there's a famous philosophical argument, I don't remember what it's called, but it essentially involves somebody who lives all their life in a black and white room, and you give them every single book about color. They read, they understand it, it's all in black and white, but they understand everything about the physical nature of color, right? And if materialism is true, if this idea that everything can just be reduced to facts, then that person, by the end of reading every single book about color, should know everything about color, right? There's nothing more that they could learn. Until, of course, kind soul comes and opens the door to this black and white room, and the person who, the color master, steps out, and they look at the blue sky, the yellow sun, the green grass, and suddenly they know more about color. They didn't have to read a book, they just had to experience it. And that experience is fundamentally different. It's fundamentally other than anything they may have read. In fact, that's the type of experience you can never actually read. And what this proves, prove is a strong word, but this is more so demonstrates, is that we cannot reduce all knowledge to a certain medium, right? It's ontologically irreducible, right? Knowledge about color is ontologically irreducible to statements of and propositional facts about it. There's a certain experience, or certain knowledge that comes through experience that can't be reduced through me learning a piece of information, right? This goes back to the heart, the beating heart of this first step about ontological, or rather the fact that consciousness can't be reduced to brain. It's known as the brainwaves. It's the hard problem of consciousness, right? This is not about, oh, we don't know enough yet about consciousness and maybe one day. This is addressing the fact that, third person experiences, or neural descriptions rather, they are third person experiences, right? I'm learning about something else. Even if I'm learning my own brain, I'm the object. I'm the subject of my object, right? I am both object and subject in that world. But it's a third person experience. It is quantitative. It is spatially bound, right? When I learn about neural descriptions, and they're observable, everyone else can see them. Whereas your consciousness is only accessible to you, and that's why it's called the first person. It is qualitative. You can't measure the size of your thought, right? You can't measure the depth of your thinking. You can use these in metaphorical ways, but they're fundamentally other. They're not amenable to any physical description. Therefore, they are not physical. Physical things can be measured, weighed. They have an electric charge. They have a spin. If they're small enough, right? They have a spin. But none of these things apply to thoughts, right? Now, again, as I mentioned earlier, these thoughts are modulated through the brain. We'll accept that premise for now, but they are not brain, right? In the same way that an orchestra is modulated through the instrument, but it is not the instrument, right? It is modulated through sound waves, you can even say, or vibrations of air, but it is not the vibrations of air. In the same way that the map is not the territory, right? The map will help you navigate the territory, but it is not the territory, and certainly not the experience of hiking, right? That's the difference between a third person description and a first person conscious description. First person descriptions are qualitative in nature, right? Um, Now I can think about, this thought lasted 3 seconds, right? So in some kind of very, very loosely, there's a meta description of thinking, but the thought itself defies any physical description. It's intrinsically subjective, right? And it's not spatially extended in any way, right? So that's essentially, this is again, it's known as the hard problem of consciousness. It's a big thing in cognitive science and neuroscience and the philosophy of mind that you can look into. With David Chalmers popularized the idea, I believe it was in the 90s, but it's an idea that's existed for quite some time. Um, and if consciousness, think about this, if consciousness can't be reduced to materialism, to material substances, right, we can say that consciousness is an emergent property, which is sort of like, at some point, if all these things come in the right way, there's a magic that happens, magic of strong emergence. I'll have a separate video about that sometime. Um, we can secondly argue that consciousness is fundamental to reality, and that's the idealist or panpsychist position. And I can also say that physical reality is derivative of consciousness. So consciousness first, and physical reality comes later. Naturalism, the only position of those three positions, the only one that naturalism might be amenable to is the idea of emergence. But even in that world, you have matter, and then you have this sudden interiority. They have this sudden experience of matter. How can matter experience itself? That's, to me, that's effectively like a metaphysical rupture, right? Where there's this big jump. Theism or idealism offer a level of continuity. And that ultimate reality is mind-like, right? And what I have to explain in that world is that no, reality is fundamentally mind-like. What I have to explain is these physical sensations. But I would encourage you to close your eyes and think about what you actually have access to. You have access to this bedrock isness, and sensations and thoughts, they impinge on this isness, but there is this isness, this consciousness that is fundamental, and it is the only thing you fundamentally have access to. And everything else is modulated through your physical organs that impinge on your consciousness, right? But there's this fundamental, and nobody has access to it. That's the thing. You can't measure this thing. It's just like this arena where everything happens, right? And we like to think, we look at the arena, we think the arena is all about the players, but what about the ground? And this is the ground of all experience. So, bottom line here, consciousness can't be reduced to any physical explanation or anything physical, because physical things, they may have a consciousness, but as far as we know, we only have our own awareness, and that first person consciousness, it is not logically entailed by third person physical descriptions, and it's therefore ontologically irreducible. It's the bedrock thing, and it's from there we can start to build our argument for God's existence.
So, the second objection that I want to tackle deals with my second step. The second step in my argument was that the highest act of consciousness is self sacrifice. So, I have to define my terms a little bit. What do you mean by highest act of consciousness? What does self sacrifice have to do with it? Um, the, the, the question here is self giving, right? Self sacrifice, is it logically entailed by consciousness? So let's dissect this a little bit. What is consciousness? So consciousness, we already talked about what consciousness is, but consciousness, there's always an aboutness to consciousness. You're always conscious frequently about something, even if it is about yourself. There's still an awareness of what is going on. And when I say what is going on, it is like there's something external to you that you're thinking, even if it is about yourself. So the term for that is that I'm going to use is intentionality. It's the aboutness of consciousness. Every act of consciousness is directed towards some object, even if that object is the subject. But for simplicity, let's talk about things external to the subject. So the subject is you're looking at something. Um, that thing that you're looking at must be the thing that is seen. That's something external to you. Judging. On the other side of that is the thing being judged. If you love somebody, there is the thing that is loved, right? It's not, this is not an optional thing. This is logically entailed. It's constitutive to what consciousness is. Consciousness is not a self contained presence. It is always standing outside of itself, and it's always about something, right? Here now is the kind of the overlooked piece of it. So consciousness, there's an aboutness, it's about something outside of itself. But for consciousness to be about something, it must allow the object to determine it in some way, right? So think of it this way. If I'm looking at a tree, right, my mind has to conform to the tree's structure. The tree doesn't conform to my desire. I am allowing the tree, right, because it is not conscious as far as we can tell. But the mind has to open itself up, has to surrender itself in some small way to allow the image of the tree to imprint on it. Imprint meaning to shape it in some way. So the surrender is not moral or anything like that, but it's almost like a structural self limitation, right? And if I don't structurally limit itself, then the truth, it becomes a self projection, becomes a projection, and knowledge is just a solipsism. So think about it this: if if the mind isn't conforming to reality, then anytime I see something that I'm not conforming, it's just the mind projecting something out there and then looking back at the thing that it just projected. So the only thing that exists is you, and that's solipsism. And these are for various reasons unacceptable. We have to. Hopefully, most of you see it that way. That there is things outside of your own subjectivity, but in order for the subject to appropriately experience the object, there has to be a sort of self limitation to it. And this self giving, it's in its full kind of moral form, it makes space for the other, right? It empties itself in some way, and it allows their reality, the reality of the thing being observed, to shape your reality, right? Ultimately, one can argue that it actually is prioritizing the good of the other. Intentional cognition does those first two things. The third one is a bit of a jump, so I'll talk about that. But think about it this way: to know the truth, I have to first empty myself, of the falsehood, right? And then I have to submit to what is out there, right? So there's a certain epistemic humility, if you will, to this, to any sort of intentionality, any sort of observation. It's almost proto-sacrificial because, in some sense, the self has to decrease a little bit in order to make space for that external thing to embed itself into consciousness, even for a moment, so that that sensation can take place. So, um, consciousness is not fundamentally self-assertive, right? And if it was, it couldn't be intentionally directed in any way. A pure self-enclosed consciousness can't have aboutness; it could only be about itself. But then there's nothing there except itself. And this actually matters to the concept of God, and therefore there has to be some heterogeneity in personhood within God in order for God to be able to experience something, in order for God to experience itself that isn't purely solipsistic. That's an argument that we don't have to get into for now. But the clean version of this argument, if you will, is that consciousness is essentially intentional, right? It is about something other than itself, or it has the capacity to be about something other than itself. But to be about something else, there has to be first an openness, right? To that, there's an epistemic humility, as we talked about. There then has to be this self limitation, right? And then that structural self limitation is sort of like the minimal viable product, if you will, minimal viable metaphysical form of self giving, because I have to decrease in order for the thing to increase enough so that it penetrates, impinges on my consciousness. And therefore, self limitation is really the minimal metaphysical act of self giving. And if consciousness is fundamental, then self giving relationality is therefore fundamental. And this is where I think we can really see theism, or at least this God of the Bible, the God of love, I should say, shine. Right? Another objection that I want to talk about is the idea that, well, isn't intentionality just representation? Why am I sneaking in all this language about self giving? And I don't think representation is, frankly, enough. So, if intentionality were just merely like internal representation, then the mind constructs symbols, the symbols correlate with the world, and there's no real openness to the other that's ultimately required. But this, I think, it collapses into a bit of a computational loop, if you will, because pure representation, right, cannot explain the truth. Because for a representation to be true, it has to be answerable to reality, and a hallucination, for example, it's still a representation. But the difference between a hallucination and a perception is not some internal structure. It's actually a successful conformity with what's actually other, right? So intentionality is not simply modeling. There's a certain answerability, if that's a word, to that which is out there, right? There's a certain relation to that which is out there. And this answerability implies a receptivity, right? To be answerable to reality, subject to reality, the object can correct me, it can resist my projection, and it ultimately constrains my thinking. Um, and what that means is consciousness is not ultimately sovereign. It's there's a vulnerability to what is out there. I can't decide what I'm seeing fully, because if I'm truly in line with reality, then I can't control that which is out there. I have There's a certain vulnerability to what I see, and I have to be receptive to that. We're going to have to be ontologically open to it. But if consciousness is purely this self-contained representation, then error would be possible, and everything would just be internally generated, and we're back to this solipsistic world. The good news is we actually the errors do exist. We do see, and therefore genuinely consciousness is really genuinely exposed to reality, right? And I think this whole like self-limitation thing, it's not just a metaphor, right? Consider judgment. If I say, I don't know, if the earth is flat but the earth is actually spherical, the truth requires that I relinquish that belief, right? And that relinquishing is not a metaphor. It's the displacement of my mental structure by reality. My mind has to conform to the truth. If you look at Aquinas or Aristotle, um, the they all talk about this idea of the mind conforming to the thing being perceived, and this conformity requires a letting reality take priority. It's yielding cognitive control. These are ideas that, frankly, in the 21st century, we don't like very much because we are obsessed to an unhealthy degree with an unhealthy version of what we think liberty ought to look like. That's another story, though. But this yielding is actually analogous to a gift. If consciousness were fundamentally kind of self-assertive, knowledge would be impossible. The self-assertion, the idea that the consciousness is king, if you will, destroys knowledge. Their consciousness is relational. It's always interacting with something else that is outside of itself, because knowing really requires contact with the external world, letting the object be what it is, and allowing it to determine your form of cognition. Right, and if consciousness refuses that, it collapses into mere projection, and that's just like an epistemic narcissism. The possibility of truth presupposes ontological openness, right? And that ontological openness presupposes structural self-giving, right? Under a strict physicalism, which I'll discuss more in another video, conscious states are survived, or rather, they're basically survival optimized neural outputs, right? And the truth is some sort of has adaptive utility, and representation doesn't have to conform to reality; it only conforms to function. But what I'm saying here is that the very intelligibility of truth presupposes that consciousness is ordered toward conformity with that which transcends it, and there's an ordering. That ordering toward is teleological, and it's not some representational machinery of some sort. So, bottom line here, right? Intentionality is not internal representation of a thing. It is it's addressable. It's rather it is answerable to what is other, and that answerability requires a receptivity, a back and forth, and that receptivity and that back and forth requires a self limitation because I have to empty myself to allow the thing to impinge on my reality in some way and shape my reality. And that is essentially the form of self giving, right? Um, and I really think this is how we get to this idea that, if 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 consciousness is fundamental to reality and native to this consciousness is intentionality. This intentionality is ultimately self-sacrificial, right? Then that which is fundamental to reality, which is consciousness, right? Not your consciousness, not my consciousness, but the ground of both our consciousnesses, right? Right, is something that is fundamentally self-sacrificial, and it is there that I can really see God, the nature of who God is. Now, I'm not going to quite get to the God of the Bible, but what I actually I really think I can from that point, because if consciousness is the fundamental base of reality, and I haven't argued that the fact that it's fundamental, but it can't be explained by materialism. In a future video, I will argue that materialism is, to use the words of Bernardo Castro, baloney. But consciousness, all right, as this thing that we all have access to, if you think about the nature of that thing that we all have access to, it must sacrifice itself in order to understand the other, right? Now, the argument that must be made in the future is, well, is this consciousness, if you will, this self-sacrificial consciousness, um, what makes me think that, it's not just a property, or rather, it's why do I have to stop at the fact that, okay, it's something that is there, but why does it have to be a god? Why use the term god, even if it is fundamental to human reality? Is it fundamental to all of the cosmos? That's an argument I'm going to make in the future. But I believe it is. So stay tuned about that. But at the very least, we can all agree, or we can all hopefully have convinced you, or at least partially convinced me, at least made you think of consciousness being a fundamental part of reality, right? And that consciousness cannot fully exist unless it is self-sacrificial. And to me, if consciousness truly is the ground of all reality, and we are all sort of outgrowths of consciousness, and we can all experience the self-sacrifice, then that thing that we're all tied into, right, this ground of all consciousness, it itself must self-sacrifice in the same way our consciousness must self-sacrifice in order to interact with the world. This ground of all being must self-sacrifice, but not just for, to detect or to be intentional, but really to allow all these other consciousness to participate in it, right? And so, in some sense, the thing that we're all tied into is this big foundation of consciousness, and it must do the most sacrificing for everything, for all consciousness. And I think this is the fundamental story of the God of love, of the God of Scripture, where the God of the Bible, he is love, and he spends a greater part of the Old Testament using laws, using the stick, the rod, if you will, to demonstrate that love. And what happens in the New Testament is that, um, th- this creator God decides to become, and decides is probably a strong word, but descends, and empties himself, as I think Saint Paul talked about, empties himself and takes the form of a servant. And I think this is, if there's any picture of God that is out there in any religion or any story, I think the God of the Bible comes closest. And this is why I personally obviously, been thinking about it for a long time, this argument from consciousness. So I hope you like it too. Uh, Give this video a like if you liked it, made you think. Even if you don't agree with everything, if it's made you think, give it a like, subscribe, and leave a comment. And let's have an interesting discussion. Thanks a lot, everyone.